Okay, welcome to part three of this series that we're doing, the history of Jerusalem, history of Israel, the history of the Jewish people. And as I've said before, this primarily or originally it was intended for those who are going to Israel, uh, especially with Emmanuel Fellowship, but it could be anywhere. Uh, just to understand greater, what you could be seeing in just the rich history. Also, I think I would also highly recommend it for anyone who just wants to understand the Middle East and Israel and all the problems and even some of the prophetic aspects of what's going to be happening. This history, I think, will give you a good background. So today, we are going to pick up with the Islamic period in Israel, and it's a very long period. It's important that we know. I'm going to go through this really fast. Um, and like I said in earlier sessions, I encourage you, if something catches your attention, take some time and to, look at it a little bit further. Okay. So, but at least I want to kind of give an overview of what we can expect. Okay. So, uh, Muhammad is, of course, the leader of Islam. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of Muhammad and his character and all that. I just want to just kind of mention a few things. One of the things that Muhammad did was, well, first of all, I should probably say that Muhammad had basic understanding, probably superficial, but kind of a basic understanding of Christianity. But he had a lot of things mixed up. And in fairness, the church that was in Arabia at the time, it was very lukewarm, and there was just a lot of just mixed up doctrinal issues and just kind of crazy ideas floating around. And so Muhammad enters into the picture in that context. And one of the things that Muhammad did, and you can read on your own a lot more about this, he began to have these night visions. And in these night visions, and the angel Gabriel, I kind of say quote unquote because I don't believe that's really what happened. He would come to him, and while he was in a trance, and he would dictate messages to him, and he would write them down. And so the Quran, even though it was written several hundred years later, is based upon a lot of these night visions and things that supposedly the angel Gabriel told Muhammad. Now, one of the things he talked to Muhammad about a lot, and again, I say that, in, you know, quote unquote, is he talked a lot about the end of the world. And he saw that the end of the world, its focus was going to be on Jerusalem. And in fact, he would often talk about the last days. He would talk about the judgment. He would talk about the hour, and much of it centered in on Jerusalem. In fact, one night, supposedly the angel Gabriel took him to Jerusalem, and he met his fathers. He met Abraham, he met Moses, he met Adam, he met Joseph, he met Jesus. And they talked to him about different things that were going to be happening. Now, again, I say all this, I don't believe this is true, but this was what he was getting in the trances. And so, therefore, the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad, they do mix in aspects of Christianity, actually quite a bit. But it's also, you know, um, a lot of things that are anti-biblical too. Well, um, I'm going to kind of skip the life of Muhammad, but basically, at the end of Muhammad's life, he begins to kind of conquer areas of Arabia, and he would insist, actually, enforce might be a better way to put it, that they would convert to his teachings, which was at some point called Islam. And in the 1600s, or not 1600s, the 600s, all of a sudden there are the Arabs, because they're the first ones to embrace this message. They began these holy wars of conquest, okay, and our jihads. And by 636, the whole eastern area of the Roman Empire, which was kind of the Byzantine Empire, it pretty much fell to these holy wars of conquest. And Jerusalem, of course, being in the east, fell with it. And Jerusalem was really a choice prize for the Muslims, and because they especially felt like that the Temple Mount was holy, just like the Jews did, and even Christians. In fact, they actually believe the Mount of Olives, that the Mount of Olives is where the Messiah, their version of the Messiah, is to come. And that's kind of interesting because, the Jews believe that and the Christians believe that too. Of course, it's for us, it's Jesus coming back, and but they saw that, according to Muhammad, that the Temple Mount was actually the original paradise in spoken in the Garden of Eden. And by the way, Jewish tradition also kind of says that. We talked about that. So see, there's a lot of overlap here. So anyway, so when they took over, there was a man named Abd al-Malik, and he became Islam's really first official ruler or caliph, and he probably shaped Islam more than anyone else, as far as, what we believe, what we don't believe, this is what we're going to be doing. And one of the first things that was built there in Jerusalem was the Dome of the Rock. And it was finished in 691. And it has dominated the skyline of Jerusalem into this day. And it is built on the Temple Mount. In fact, that causes a lot of problems today between the Jews and the Muslims in Jerusalem. In fact, the Dome of the Rock, it overshadowed very much so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that we talked about last time. In fact, the Dome of the Rock probably ranks with the temples of Solomon and Herod as one of the most successful building projects in ancient history. And of course, today, the Dome of the Rock is a symbolism of Palestinian nationalism as well. So the Dome of the Rock, again, finished, being completed 691, and it's been there ever since. Okay, now also, Abd al-Malik and his son, Walid, they built Al-Aqsa and Aksa. And that is a mosque located also on the Temple Mount next to the Dome of the Rock. Now, it's much smaller, but it's still big. It can hold, it's got a seating capacity of about 5,000 people. Okay, and it was about this time that it was instituted that Friday was the worship day for Islam. And even today, Fridays in Jerusalem, people pile into the the Temple Mount to worship, Allah, their God. So anyway, the Muslims begin to spread across North America into Spain. And one of the things that they do is that they change the language, because up to this time, the official or the trade language of at least the Eastern Mediterranean world and North Africa was really Greek. Well, they changed it to Arabic, and it's been Arabic ever since then. Okay, so again, I'm just kind of going through just really a real brief history here. Now, over the next hundreds of years, there were different dynasties of caliphs or Islamic rulers that ruled the Islamic world, especially in the Middle East. From about 660 to 750, there were the Umayyads. And then from 750 to 969 were the Abbasids. And by the way, it was during the Abbasids, that's considered sort of the golden age of Islam. Because one of the things that they did is they borrowed a lot of the learning, a lot of the culture from the Byzantine Empire, and they adopted it. And really, it's considered the golden age. There's a lot of education, a big emphasis on education, and actually the Byzantine and the Islamic world in this time were much more advanced and much more literate than, let's say, Western civilization in Europe. Okay, so after the Umayyads, there were the Abbasids. Oh, I just mentioned that 750 to 969. And about this time, maybe the other thing we could probably say is that Baghdad was really the center of uh, power. And and there's stories associated with all these, like the Abbasids at one point invited the Umayyads at the beginning of their dynasty to a big banquet to talk peace, and then it was really an ambush, and they slaughtered all of them, and that's how they ended up taking over that dynasty. So definitely not a real. There's not Christian love involved there. Then after that, there was the Fatimids, and that was 969 to about 1099. And it was during this time that the Druze of Lebanon, they sort of separated from Islam, kind of mixed in some Christianity, and the Druze of Lebanon are still there. It's a separate sect or religion. They don't consider themselves Muslims. They don't consider themselves Christians, but they are a powerful political influence in the country of Lebanon even today. So you've probably, some of you who've kind of watched the Middle East and some of the cultural things, you probably have heard of the Druze. Okay, in 1099, the First Crusade reaches Jerusalem. And again, this is a very interesting period in church history, a very interesting period in just Western civilization. And I should probably preface what I'm going to say by saying that even though these were Christian crusades, there were a lot of the crusades were anything but Christian, you know. But it was, and well, I want to kind of keep getting in a lot of details here, but one of the things that the crusades were, part of the motivation was as an attempt to kind of unify Europe, unify the church, bring more money into the church, and it was also, we need to kind of rescue the Holy Land from the infidels, the Muslims, and there's a series of, depending on how you define them, probably anywhere from 9 to maybe 11 or 12 different crusades over the next couple hundred years. And the crusade would just be a group of people who would actually just kind of all band together. They'd go into the Holy Land, and the first crusade was probably the most successful. It reaches Jerusalem in 1099. Godfrey of Bouillon, he French, he was the leader, and they actually liberated Jerusalem. They liberated the Holy City, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which really had, in the Catholic period of the church, that was really the most holy place, there in, Jerusalem. But sadly, what they did is when they conquered Jerusalem, they pretty much slaughtered all the inhabitants, all the um, all the Muslims and the pockets of Jews as well. They just slaughtered them, and they did it in the name of Christ, which is very unfortunate. And so Godfrey becomes the um, he refused to kind of take the title of king, but he became really the first prince of this new kingdom, and and basically there are four Crusader states that emerge. There is the Principality of Antioch, which is up close to where the old Antioch is. It talks about in the Bible. It's up in northern Syria, part of Turkey, that area. And then they had the county of Edessa and Tripoli. And I encourage you to take a look at a map and just kind of see this. And then there's the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So there are like four different Crusader states. And one reason the Crusades were successful is that as the Islamic world was divided at this time, and so it was easily conquered. There wasn't really much of a will to resist the I don't even really want to call it the Christian forces, the European forces. We'll just kind of say that, you know. And and by the way, uh, when the Crusaders went through the Byzantine Empire, they weren't very kind to the Byzantine people either, you know. And but they marched on to Jerusalem, conquered Jerusalem, and they set up a kingdom. Well, Geoffrey died about a year later after he got there of typhoid, and actually died in Jaffa, and he was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, then Baldwin, Baldwin the I, he became really the first king of Jerusalem, and he reigned about 18 years from 1100 to 1118, more or less. And I'm kind of looking at my notes here to get these dates exactly right. And and the Crusaders, they kind of changed the story. They kind of said that the dome of the rock and Al Aqsa, you know, the mosque that was built next to it, was really built by King Solomon, and that he had turned it into something Christian. So, I mean, definitely kind of, you know, kind of exaggerated and kind of, well, not just exaggerated, they just kind of made up things. And but the Dome of the Rock was all of a sudden a Christian landmark. Okay, the Tower of David, which had already been built, it was built into a fortress that the and actually even today those Crusader arches are still visible. If you know as you kind of enter the old city from the gate of Jerusalem. Uh, then Bald the Little, he was the next king, started an order of military knights called the Templars. And of course, there's a lot of colorful history related to the Templars because the Knights of the Templars, they were the guardians of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Um, Jerusalem, and I'm sort of focusing in on Jerusalem here. The main languages were French, German, Italian, but actually you had languages from all over Europe, you know, and there was lots of drama. All sorts of Europeans, mostly rich people, kind of poured in, and also Eastern Christians, such as the Armenians, kind of came in too, and the Orthodox from the Byzantine Empire, they began to kind of pour in a little bit too. Actually, the Crusader states were called the Outre-mer, and that's a French word which basically means like overseas or across the sea, I guess literally. And these were supposedly the glory days of Jerusalem. But in reality, there's a lot of sin, there's a lot of luxury. Here's a quote that I kind of picked up somewhere. Outre-mer was the medieval version of the Wild West. Murderers, adventurers, harlots came to make their fortune. And they said that there were bars everywhere, and it was a place for it was a it was a place of sin, and that's why I kind of say, you know, very I hesitate to say it was a Christian era, even though it was kind of ruled by those associated with the Christian church. Uh, Now, on the other hand, many went to Jerusalem to die, you know, and if they made their fortunes in Europe, they like to go to Jerusalem because, after all, Jesus was going to return, and he will, to the Mount of Olives, and they wanted to be, somehow they felt like they'd be some of the first ones to be resurrected. And in fact, on the Mount of Olives today, uh, much more than olive trees, there are some of those, but it just goes, someone said, I'm not sure this is true, it's the world's largest cemetery. And it just, you look out and there's Jews, there's Christians, there's Muslims, they're all kind of buried in, you know, on the Mount of Olives because they all want to be the first ones to resurrect. And of course, we know as more biblical Christians, it doesn't quite work that way. But um, you know, it is. You know, I'm just giving you kind of the story here. Another very colorful person in this time was a famous queen. Her name was Melisende, and uh, and she actually reigned. I'm giving these are the dates of her reign from 1131 to 1153, and she was probably one of the better um, crusaders. I mean, I think she really wanted to be friends with the neighbors. She was also very interested in architecture and developing. In fact, there's a number of the buildings in Old Jerusalem that were built by her or under her direction. Probably the most famous one is St. Anne's Church. And in fact, you go in there and the acoustics are just unbelievable. I can talk like this and it just kind of echoes. It just sounds really loud. I mean, it's considered an architectural wonder, really. And um, and she also redid part of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because it was in need of lots of repairs, and so it was kind of expanded. So she was really the real ruler, and even after um, her, she had a her son was Baldwin III, and he was 12 years old, and even after he got older, she's still the one that you know ruled. Okay, then there is Baldwin IV, and he reigned from 1174 to 1185, and he was a teenager, but he was actually a very good ruler. But the thing he's known for is that he had leprosy, and he tried hiding it for years. And he would, and even after everyone knew, he would wear an iron mask over his face where people wouldn't see him. And he actually participated as a teenager in some of the battles and things like that. And again, a very if you just kind of like to just kind of read the story of him and 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 the days of Baldwin IV. Well, um, the Crusader States lasted about 200 years, which is a really long time, really. And then the Muslims, which were all in the area, they began to get unified again. And there's a man named Saladin. And Saladin was able to get a multinational army together of Kurds, of Arabs, of Turks, of Sudanese, and then in 1187, Saladin surrounds Jerusalem, and 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 he and the leaders of Jerusalem, they agree to peace terms, um, and Saladin, many of the people there were made into slaves, but a lot of them were released. At least all the leaders were, and the people of Jerusalem were allowed to go out freely. And this was probably in contrast to when the Europeans conquered Jerusalem, where they slaughtered everyone. Saladin was actually probably a pretty good guy. He was not a dictator. He was rather fair to the people, especially for Muslim leaders. You know, uh, Christians could, they could buy their freedom. The ones even who were enslaved and leave, and so a lot of the Christians left Jerusalem for good. And again, when I say Christians, I'm talking about Europeans, those who, uh, I'm not so sure they were really truly Christians. But Saladin loved Jerusalem, and he actually tolerated most of the churches, let them stay there. But he did kind of say, no church fails. That was his one thing that he said. And and because he had a hard time repopulating Jerusalem after all the Europeans left, he actually invited the Armenians back, and they still are there today in the in the in the um, Armenian quarter of Old Jerusalem, and the people there, they trace their times all the way back to Saladin. Um, well, there's some more crusades that were started to try to win Jerusalem back. And the Third Crusade, especially, is probably a very famous one because it involves Saladin and also Richard the Lionheart, coming from Europe, and also Philip II from France. And if you know anything about European history, these were like two very, famous people. And basically, when they kind of came, it ended in a peace treaty. This is around 1192, and Saladin was going to keep Jerusalem, but Acre, which is north of or it's kind of a little bit south of Haifa today. It was kind of a big port city. You know, they would he would leave that to the Crusaders. So that particular Crusader state, lasted a lot longer. And Saladin also said, okay, and Christians can come to Jerusalem for the sake of pilgrimages. Okay, and by the way, I want to kind of mention too that there is a movie that was, I think, put out in 2005 called Kingdom of Heaven. And of course, it's a Hollywood representation, but it picks up on some of the drama of the Crusade period, especially with Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, and they're coming to peace. And it would be one of those movies that I would suggest. It's probably has a little bit more violence than a lot of movies, so you probably want to be able to use discretion for younger children. Okay, so the Saladin dynasty, which actually included his his sons and grandchildren, went from 1193 to about 1250. And then the Tartars came in and they conquered Jerusalem. And then the Mongols, they kind of raided Jerusalem. And after that, it was the Baybars. And the Baybars, they were a Islamic dynasty that went from 1250 to 1277, more or less. And then after them, the Mamluks from 1277 to 1339, they came into Jerusalem. So this is, again, just another example of just different people controlling Jerusalem. And these particular ones, they actually kind of conquered it, because there were wars to kind of, for them to, earlier before the Crusades, the dynasties sort of, it was more of a peaceful transition. These were not so much. And the Mamluks, they were actually a Caucasian race from sort of what would you kind of call it, the part of Asia, where the Kyrgyzstan and Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan and all that, they came from that area. And then after that, we get the Ottoman Empire. And really, the Ottoman Empire took over, and they took over in the early 1500s, and they were in power really until World War One, and they controlled Jerusalem and the land of Israel for basically 400 years or so. One of the first leaders of the Ottoman Empire was Suleiman. I know it sounds a lot like Saladin, but it's not. Suleiman, and he was 1517 to 1550. And one of the things that he did, he had a real interest in Jerusalem, and he wanted to rebuild Jerusalem. In fact, some people call him the second Solomon. He actually kind of called himself that. And he was and he because he just had he had a desire to build things, and he did all over the Ottoman Empire, but especially Jerusalem was of special interest to him. And so he shaped the old city as it is today. Pretty much, you can goes back to the early 1500s and the times of Suleiman. One of the things he did is he retiled the Dome of the Rock, and supposedly it took 450,000 tiles to do this. And also, during his time, the city population tripled, and the Jews doubled. In fact, during the Ottoman Empire, there was Jewish families, it was limited, but there was a certain amount of Jewish families that were allowed to stay in Jerusalem. And they are really you could say, the ancestors to the Jewish quarter today in the old city. It was also probably about the 1700s, you get a lot of the Arab families that began to dominate the politics and the culture of Jerusalem really until the War of Independence, and the big family is the Husseinis, and you'll probably, well, actually when we kind of get closer to the War of Independence, we'll kind of bring them back up again. Maybe just one other thing I should just kind of mention, or two other things. In the From 1799 to 1806, Napoleon. Remember Napoleon? Most people have heard. He was actually in the Holy Land. He was in the Egypt mainly, but he was in the Middle East. But he had a dream, not a literal dream, but it was a personal dream. He wanted to conquer Jerusalem, and he wanted to turn it over to the Jews. And he's really the first person in somewhat modern history that actually had the idea that the Jews need to go back to Israel. And in fact, he actually proclaimed, he made a proclamation, to the Jews, a proclamation to the Jews, telling them they need to go back to Jerusalem. And so Napoleon ends up being a very important person in Jewish history, because he is one of the first ones to popularize this idea of going back. Now, I should probably kind of say that he did not conquer Jerusalem. In fact, he never even reached Jerusalem because he got called back to France because of some pressing needs there. But it's probably something to kind of mention. The other thing I just want to kind of mention, and because I know some of the people who are listening to this are family members who are going to, Philip's family members. A couple of years ago, when I was doing my ancestry, following, if you go all the way back to the 1100s, there's a man named Aaron, son of Rice, and he was part of he was part of the Templars. He was also part of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, started by Godfrey, and he went to Jerusalem with Richard the Lionheart and fought there. So anyway, just kind of a kind of interesting thing. When I read that, I thought, oh yeah, you know. But I've tried to kind of read some more information about him, and not anything there. Well, anyway, so that's sort of, I know that's we've kind of covered a lot today, but I really want to kind of cover the Islamic area. Now we're going to start slowing up a little bit and getting into a little bit more detail. Thank you.